Well, this is a topic that gives me great joy. About 20 years ago, I decided I'd bring the stories that I was reading to my children into the classroom, maybe even 25 years ago now, after they had decided that they didn't want Daddy to be reading to them regularly anymore. So I brought it into the classroom. Of course, my dean didn't think much of the idea. I wanted a summer grant to prepare the course, which he refused me because he wondered why anybody would bring fairy tales into the classroom. But he was a chemist. You have to forgive him. He was a chemist. He was what I call a flat planet. He lacked moral imagination, but I taught it anyway. It became a very popular course that I limited actually to 15 or 20 at Loyola. When I got to UVA some 7, 8 years ago, I expanded it to 30. The last time I taught it last year, there were 30 in the classroom, but there were over 100 on the wait list, and that's when they started giving up. It was a terrible agony to refuse them, but the way I teach is the way of having them write 8 or 9 papers, short papers, 2 lengthy papers. I read those short papers, and my discussion and lectures are based in the writing of my students. If I had to read papers from 100 students, it would be impossible. That's my justification for denying all the rest of them. Of course, that means that it's virtually completely filled with fourth-year seniors. But it's always been a joy, and anticipating that many of you, if not most of you, would be students of college age, I've tried to adjust my comments a little bit to be sort of addressing you, because while my interest in the fairy tales and great children's stories was primarily about the moral formation of children, small children, what I learned in the classroom over all these years is that they have an incredible formative influence on 20-year-olds. It's not limited to just children. I should have known that to begin with, but I learned much more than I expected about the impact of this kind of imaginative literature on college students. And I'll say more about that in a few moments. Now, it's true that when I wrote Tending the Heart of Virtue, How Classic Stories Awaken a Child's Moral Imagination, I had children in mind. I had particularly the troubled times for children in our culture today. A range of dangers, that exists. It's physical, moral, and spiritual. And that we can't understate that. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I wrote it not for my academic colleagues so much as for parents, teachers in Sunday schools, and others who were in the teaching profession perhaps, but not necessarily on the college level. So this concern about children has been one that has been mine through most of my adult life. June and I now have 3 grandchildren, the 4th coming in February, and I've started all over again. I'm discovering all sorts of things that I'd forgotten maybe. So while I've promised Oxford University Press I would write a 2nd edition, expanded edition, I want to make good on it, but I'm waiting a little bit because I want to learn a little bit more from my grandchildren. I was reading to my 4-year-old granddaughter, Virginia, Peter Pan. And my wife was listening in from downstairs. She was asking me these questions that were well beyond my own comprehension. And my wife said to me after I'd finished, she said, "I can't believe what that little thing was asking you." I said, "Listen to it and you believe it." And so I'm going to learn a lot more, God willing. Now, the modern sophists who populate so many of our media and our educational institutions, they would persuade us that there's nothing absolute or permanent in morality. But our Christian faith teaches us otherwise. And that's why we must endeavor to affirm the enduring and permanent things, to cultivate the moral imagination wherever we go and into whatever walk of life we enter. For we believe that a gracious God governs our universe, and that the sort of life we live has consequence and eternal significance. So the kind of ship into which we cast off into the sea of life our children and young adults makes a difference as to whether we sink in the abyss or reach the shores of paradise. I don't mean to be just waxing poetic. I mean it. True education is not just about mastering skills or filling our minds with information. True education is about making virtuous persons. It really is about building up a moral imagination that will serve a person through the whole of life. Genuine Christian education, to my way of thinking, is about cultivating the soul so that it is a temple fitted for the Holy Spirit, about nurturing even those virtues of which Jesus spoke in the Beatitudes. Some years ago, I was invited to speak on the topic of why businessmen should read great literature to the faculty of Fordham University Business School. The fellow who invited me was a provocateur, heading toward retirement. So he said, "I'm going to unleash you upon them." I said, "What do you have in mind?" He said, "Chaos." So he did unleash me upon them. And when I got to the point where I said we should be interested in the souls of our students, there was this murmuring everywhere. And I was challenged, first of all, challenged to have even a belief in the soul. I mean, it was outright. They were not happy with me. And so I turned to him and I said, "Okay, it's chaos. Now what do we do?" You know. So I said to him, "What if they start throwing fruit at me? What do I do then?" Well, I'll speak momentarily about the moral imagination. And this is a text, and you're going to see something of an academic presentation, but I hope it's in a speaking voice. And how it functions, how it's formed. But I want to talk first about the virtues, which are in service of the moral imagination. And I think of the virtues as gems. Each is a solid with a permanent color and shape. And if we throw a diamond into a pond and let it stay for 1,000 years, the diamond will not change or diminish in beauty, and there will be no mistaking it for a common stone. I think the virtues are like that. They are among the permanent things of divine and human nature, and they possess an enduring quality. They certainly are not abstract. They come through us through stories within traditions, but nonetheless, most great religions and cultures have named them: love and justice, faith and courage, hope and temperance. And if we embrace and practice the virtues, they become our habit. And holiness comes within our reach. St. Peter tells us that, and I am quoting, "We may become partakers of the divine nature." And he goes on to say, however, that in order to make good this gift of the Spirit, we ourselves must with all diligence add to our faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness. The virtues are our path to becoming fully human. We do not invent them. Rather, they belong to human nature, and human nature is not whole without them. They define and they constitute what is good character. They are precedent even to the choices we make. No one chooses to become courageous any more than he or she chooses to be cowardly. One is either courageous or one is cowardly. There is no in between. When we say a person is courageous, we mean that the virtue of courage belongs to the essence of who and what that person is, and how he or she acts out and enacts his or her own life. Now, how do the virtues come to exist in persons? They come to exist through example and exercise. Starting in the home, as we assume our first offices as sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, and then in the school or on the playing field. The virtues grow into habits that define the will even before volition. Moral character, a virtuous character, is therefore a habitual orientation of the self toward the world that disposes a person to act out of a sense of what is right and to do that which is good in every instance. So think of the virtues as the powers of habit that enable us to avoid evil and to do what is good and to grow into wholeness and holiness. Now, moral rules and principles are not sufficient, though some think they are. Their application for good or ill depends entirely upon the character of the agent and the spiritual light of the moral imagination that illumines the landscape of a person's life. If we merely memorize moral rules and principles, which so many ethics courses in the academy have us do, without the support of virtue and a moral imagination, we might just as easily use these rules and principles for selfish and pernicious purposes as for good. This lesson is taught by Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, in an essay he called The Education of Character. He tells the story of an early experience when teaching a course on ethics. He was a young man at that point. He explains that he committed the terrifying mistake of giving mere instruction in rules and principles, as he states it, rather than attending to the formation of character in his pupils. I quote him, "I tried to explain to my pupils that envy is despicable, and at once I feel the secret resistance of those who are poorer than their comrades. I try to explain that it is wicked to bully the weak, and at once I see a suppressed smile on the lips of the strong. I try to explain that lying destroys life, and something frightful happens. The worst habitual liar of the class produces a brilliant essay on the destructive power of lying." Whether or not a carpenter is a good man does not necessarily determine how well he handles a saw or a hammer or the quality of the cabinets that he builds. But morality is different. Moral rules and principles are not mere tools like the carpenter's saw or hammer. The right use of moral rules and principles depends upon the character of the agent and the manner in which that agent inhabits his world. That's the point that Buber is making. Similarly, law is not the heart or soul of morality either. The old legalism that imagines it can cover every contingency of life with rules and sanctions is just as flawed as the reformist doctrine which prescribes that all one need do is teach children to think for themselves and they will find a moral compass. Once again, the character and the virtues or vices belonging to it is the fulcrum of human morality, not law, not rules, not principles. The Greek word for character literally means an impression. Moral character is an impression stamped on the self. The quality good or ill of character is decided by the orientation of character, its consistency and constancy. We often equate freedom with morality and goodness. It's a mistake our American culture makes all the time. Freedom is good. Therefore, if you exercise freedom, things will be good. But this is naive, because freedom is transcendent and the precondition of choice, not the choice itself. Depending on one's character, one is drawn to either goodness or wickedness. Moral and immoral behavior. Is freedom enacted for good or ill? So the virtues are at the very heart of things. By formally defining the virtues, we do not make them come to life either, by giving them formal definitions. This is the sense in which we can say that the virtues cannot be taught. Aristotle tried to find a middle course, as he often did. He maintained that there are two forms of virtue. The first he called moral virtue, and the second intellectual virtue. Moral virtue grows out of habit. It grows out of life lived, whereas, he said, intellectual virtue is taught. Nonetheless, intellectual virtue remains a dry and lifeless bone, unless moral virtue infuses it with purpose, gives it a context in which to be exercised. In raising my own children, I concluded that short of prematurely throwing them directly into life's vicissitudes, stories are a medium by which the virtues, if not taught, can nevertheless be made familiar and communicated in such manner that they touch upon both the rational and the affective dimensions of the self. Stories are the most powerful medium through which the permanent things of the moral life can be brought to life for children. We lived storied lives, and so it is to stories in their special capacity to engender the virtues, build character, and birth the moral imagination, to which I have turned so often as a parent and a teacher. Stories are especially important for children because stories make up for the life experience they lack or for which they are not yet prepared. They introduce children to the virtues through characters with which they may identify, as they themselves struggle to exercise their freedom imaginatively and responsibly in relation to family and friends and the rest of their growing world. In this way, children learn the virtues by inference, and the virtues may become second nature to them. In my teaching of college students, I regularly invoke stories and bring them into the classroom. Though I have not belonged to a department of literature, nonetheless I have regularly assigned literature and poetry in my courses. For example, I start out my course on ecology, Christianity, culture by reading poetry, Wordsworth, et cetera, et cetera. Stories and poetry are the best, and the best stories invite us to enable us to evaluate and assess our own lives at whatever age. Stories do something more. They also bestow images to memory that become metaphors for the moral imagination, through which we draw analogies that clarify how we inhabit the world. The moral imagination is built up from these analogies and metaphors. Common people use metaphors even without thinking about it, by telling stories and then analogizing between stories that they tell to evaluate the course of their lives or the actions, the ethical character of the actions of friends or enemies. That is how we enact morality more often than not. And stories provide us ultimately with the metaphors and analogies that we can use in life. We store them in memory and we recall them. They often become transfigured in the process, not quite the same as what it was. But that's how the moral imagination illumines our way so that we see better and are able really to navigate life's course even in a moral way. As I've been saying, rote memory does not make moral behavior. An eminent philosopher of the last century, George Santayana, stated, follow him here, he says, "Our perceptions do not remain in the mind as would be suggested by the trite simile of the seal and the wax, passive and changeless until they fade. Rather, perceptions fall into the brain as seeds into a furrow, or even as sparks into a keg of powder. And these images, in turn, give life to more images, sometimes slowly and subterraneously, sometimes with a sudden burst of fancy." End of quote. This is the store of what I'm calling the moral imagination. In other words, the moral imagination is active, not just in our conscious and waking life, but also in our subconscious, even as we sleep. It is the self's ongoing process of finding moral direction and purpose in life. And we should attend to it in education. Though there are those who say that we should not, lest we perhaps tyrannize over the young mind. The moral imagination makes a difference in our lives, especially in our early years. And what kind of images reach our eyes and minds in those earliest years that we experience even in our bodies and the whole of what and who we are as human beings, we carry with us through the rest of life. We underestimate the power of images, whether pictorial or communicated through word and story so often. We live in an age which might be characterized as an age of the tyranny of the image. It's an interesting age we live in. Well, the age of the literate is almost being left behind, and we're returning to a time when images are even that much more important in the formation of people. Even in the realm of children's literature, it's in our century that really the importance of pictures became dominant. And so we have picture stories. We have two authorial voices sometimes speaking, but it's images. And we daren't underestimate how much those images affect what we do, consciously and unconsciously. The contemporary Eastern Orthodox theologian Andrew Louth has said that images mediate. Images bring one thing in relation to another. Images make possible meaning, and they do this because this is the way things are. This is the way God has made the world. It all relates and interconnects. And images reveal this relationship and interconnection. So, really, in children's literature, the best of children's literature, we have an opportunity, by introducing them to children, to perhaps deflect from all the other images that they're bombarded with day and day. I mean, you know, my 4-year-old, my 2-year-old knows how to use those little mechanisms, right? And they're searching up all kinds of images. We could be nonchalant about that, but believe me, those images become the store of the imagination. They can corrupt the imagination, or they can enhance the moral imagination. But we shouldn't underestimate the power of the image. Now, of course, the great children's stories and fairy tales are packed with images. That's what makes them so alluring, it seems to me. Worlds open up before us in ways that are alluring and attractive to us. And that's perhaps why I've gone back to children's literature and fairy tales so often, not only to read to my children and grandchildren or bring into the classroom, but just for my own actual sanity. Yes. So let's think, therefore, of the moral imagination as a special form of perception. It is like the light that enters the eyes and enables one to see, whilst in the darkness there is much that we cannot and do not see. Moral vision is the capacity to tell goodness from evil and, equipped with virtue, respond in each circumstance to bring goodness about rather than evil. And really, so much of the moral failure in our world is a failure of imagination, and not just a will that deliberately chooses to do what is wrong. So there's a fine line between mistake, error, and sin, you know, it shades. But so much of the failure I've seen in life, even if it's not of great moral consequence, maybe some but not great, is a failure of imagination, not a deliberate will, but a failure of imagination. Not enough images stored up in the memory to bring forth and exercise. Maybe not having exercised it enough. We don't see all the alternatives. We live in the dark rather than the light. That's what I'm getting at. Satan attacks not only our reason and will, but also imagination. Indeed, as all the saints testify, he goes first to the imagination. He corrupts and distorts it into forms with which we're all too familiar, though we may choose to ignore or deny their existence. And worse, there are dysmorphic and corrupted forms of the imagination that in our time threaten to completely crowd out the moral imagination. Let me just mention three such forms. The first is the idyllic imagination. The idyllic imagination is escapist, not necessarily in the sense that it flees physical surroundings, but rather it shirks civic, social, and personal responsibility. In its rebellious or revolutionary form, it denies and strives to destroy old dogmas, manners, and mores and replaces them with nothing. In its search for the idyllic, it might also turn to hedonistic imaginings, flagrant sensuality, as it seeks liberation from existing conventions and norms. My maturing years in the 1960s were filled with the idyllic imagination. Psychedelic drugs helped. The second is the idolatrous imagination, so rampant in society today, as it has built a cult of celebrity. It's incredible what has been built up. Our own hagiography, our own pagan pantheon of divinities. And worse still, what was once clarified in the controversies over icons and idols is now confounded. So we call celebrity idols icons. This is not just a harmless confusion of language. I think it's a confusion that goes much deeper than that. And the adoration we give these, and I say stars now, think of it as a metaphor, whether of the cinema, sports, or in politics, comes not without damage to our souls. The idolatrous imagination dominates in our culture if it is not already being overcome by a third form of imagination, the diabolic imagination. Not much more needs to be said about the name. Often it takes hold of us when the idyllic and idolatrous forms fail. Neither idyllic fantasies nor man-made divinities can satisfy the soul's yearning for communion and happiness. The diabolic imagination is a dive heels up, to use a phrase of Dostoevsky, into complete dissoluteness. It is a spiritual suicide, more often than not followed by physical suicide. But it is the moral imagination that's our concern. And in order that we may apply moral rules to a right result, the moral imagination has to be in place, and it must be active. Yet modern education ignores this truth more often than not. So I came to the conclusion some time ago that we are really failing to introduce our children, our very selves, to a world of metaphors and symbols upon which the strength of the moral imagination utterly depends. And I was helped along by that great Victorian inventor of fantasy literature, George MacDonald, one of the 7 at the Wade Center. He wrote, "No doubt the best beginning is an acquaintance with nature," speaking of children and their imagination. Thus he urged that children be encouraged to, and I quote him, "observe vital phenomena, to put things together, to speculate from what they see to what they do not see." The sort of attentiveness to nature that MacDonald recommends runs, however, much deeper than even the sort of observation and experimentation that natural science calls for. MacDonald is recommending an exercise in poiesis, an exercise in the use of language to get to the very essence of things, and to see the world in its wholeness, and to find meaning in our relationship to the world. For example, he reminds us that even, and I quote him, "the coldest word was once a glowing metaphor and bold, questionable originality. Thy very attention," the word attention, does it not mean attentio from the Latin, a stretching to? Take any word expressive of emotion, he says. Take the word emotion itself, and you will find that its primary meaning is of the outer world. The rustling and agitation of the trees is analogized to the self in its inner disturbances, and so emotion. The imagination grasps the symbolic nature of the world itself and transforms human language and knowing in the process. MacDonald believed in what I would call a sacramental world, a world in which God has planted all sorts of images that we need to observe, digest, and apply to our lives. For many years, I taught at Loyola College in Baltimore, as we mentioned, and I teach ethics. One year, I introduced to the syllabus in my ethics course Walker Percy's novel, The Thanatos Syndrome, his last novel. The protagonist of the story is a psychiatrist named, this is suspicious, Thomas More. More has a theory about human types. He divides his patients into bluebirds and blue jays. On the first day of discussing the Thanatos Syndrome, because this is brought up right at the beginning of the novel, I realized that my students did not understand Moore's metaphors of bluebird and blue jays. So I asked the students if they knew the respective habits and temperaments of bluebirds and blue jays. They did not. To begin, how many could physically identify a bluebird or a blue jay? Not very many. How many had observed these birds in nature? Not very many. These are all suburban kids, but that doesn't even begin to explain it. What then was the meaning behind Moore's categorization of his patients into these two types? It is not that my students, a sum of 60 in 2 ethics sections, lacked a practical definition of a metaphor. They'd gotten that over and over again in the English department. I was assured of that by the chair of the English department. However, they had not been provided, they'd been provided with a definition, but they lacked rather the habit of observation and poesis to which MacDonald refers. They lacked the personal knowledge of metaphor. They had a definition, but not a personal knowledge of metaphor, which only an active moral imagination engenders. Now, I not only suspected that they spent too much time indoors looking at a screen. These days you don't have to look at a screen indoors. You can pull this thing out and, there it is, right? Or out of doors equipped with earbuds. If it were up to us, language would be rather dull and flat. So you can imagine emotion would never come into the English vocabulary because we are so obsessed with staring at this with earplugs that we don't either see or hear the rustling of the trees, which we then apply to our own inner workings, right? I was also sure that my students had spent years in school being taught that learning is about collecting facts from specially prepared books that required little or no interpretation, only memorization. We really live in a culture where metaphor is discarded to make room for these so-called facts. This practice is justified by the prejudice, which you are all acquainted with if you do not believe in it, that only in these facts does the truth reside. So we train minds to detect these facts much as one breaks in a baseball glove. Meanwhile, the imagination is neglected and is left unguarded, unattended. In the last analysis, the moral imagination is that distinctively human capacity to conceive of men and women as moral and spiritual beings, as persons and not as things. In other words, to recognize that the human face is itself a window into spirits which might otherwise be hidden from us. The best of humankind's stories possess a special power to perceive spirit in the world, not just facts, and thus to recognize and affirm truth through metaphor, not merely through the scientific method. In this case, my use of window as a metaphor even for the imago Dei, the image of God that every human person is. Meanwhile, the people are fed stories that are inferior and destructive of the moral imagination, created for television, video, and computer games. Some of this is good. I don't deny it, but most of it is junk. And these have replaced other profound stories that once played a vital role in the formation and handing on of faith and culture. Plato challenges us through the voice of Socrates when he asks this rhetorical question: shall we then thus lightly suffer our children to listen to any chance stories fashioned by any chance teachers, and so take into their minds opinions for the most part contrary to those that we shall think desirable for them to hold when they are grown up? By no manner of means will we allow it. Now, biblical illiteracy is given in higher education, not among this group here that I know you're steeped in it. You have to take Old Testament, New Testament, etc. But take my word for it, biblical illiteracy is alive and well in most colleges. So too is illiteracy of the classics, but this is not the end of it. Illiteracy in the great fairy tales is just as pervasive. All these stories that have been formative to our culture, that the Victorians and Edwardians brought into the nursery, and then they were moved to create their own stories that are some of the greatest children's stories we have. One, if I could live long enough, I would write a book about this, but there are two great authors that I admire whose writing is affected by fairy tales in ways that have not yet been really explored. And those two are Dostoevsky and Dickens. Recently, I found this, an essay by Dickens on fairy tale, in which he was castigating a former illustrator that he worked with for bawdlerizing fairy tales, that is, reducing them to a common denominator and eliminating from them much of the meat of the fairy tale, something that goes on today endlessly. It's very difficult to find the original fairy tales in the kinds of books that are marketed today. And I've been trying to do it. You can find them, but it's not easy. Sometimes you're warned and it says a retelling. Sometimes you're not warned and it's still a retelling. It's very difficult. And I've been searching out because I want them for my grandchildren, but it's not easy. So the problem that Dickens was addressing in the 19th century is even more difficult today. But this is what he had to say. It's kind of interesting. We must assume that we are singular in entertaining a very great tenderness for the fairy tales of our childhood. It would be hard to estimate the amount of gentleness and mercy that has made its way among us through these channels. Forbearance, courtesy, the virtues, you see, forbearance, courtesy, consideration for the poor and aged, kind treatment of animals, love of nature, abhorrence of tyranny and brute force. Many such good things have been first nourished in the child's heart by this powerful aid. In a utilitarian age, I'm continuing, of all other times, and we are no less utilitarian in the 21st century than we were in the 19th century. We're considerably more utilitarian, not less. In a utilitarian age of all other times, it is a matter of great importance, writes Dickens, that fairy tales should be respected. Everyone who has considered the subject knows full well that a nation without fancy, without some romance, never did, never can, never will hold a great place under the sun. The theater, having done its worst to destroy these admirable fictions, and mind you, Dickens was a great lover of theater. He organized and directed his own plays all through. That was his real love, was to be an actor. Even when he went on tour and read from his own stories, he was acting. He'd take the parts of his characters, so forth and so on. So when he said they ruined the theater, this was really something he worried about. He mourned. So he goes on. He says, the theater, having done its worst to destroy these admirable fictions, having in a most exemplary manner destroyed itself, its artists, and its audiences in the perversion of its duty, it becomes doubly important that the little books themselves, nurseries of fancy as they are, should be preserved. To preserve them in their usefulness, they must be as much preserved in their simplicity and purity and innocent extravagance as they were actual fact. Whoever alters them to suit his own opinions, whatever they are, is guilty, to our way of thinking, of an act of presumption and appropriates to himself what does not belong to him. That's Dickens. Pretty strong, pretty wonderful, actually. Read Dickens and think fairy tale. He wrote fairy tales. Even in the midst of all that realism, there was the fairy tale. He wanted a happy ending most of the time. But more than that, there was magic in the stories. Dostoevsky loved fairy tales, and his novel, The Idiot, is a fairy tale. it's a terrifying fairy tale, but it is a fairy tale. Well, at the turn of the last century, G.K. Chesterton, another one from the Seven, G.K. Chesterton also came to the defense of fairy tales against those who would banish or alter them because of mistaken notions about them. Fairy tales do not give the children the first idea of bogey, he argued. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of the bogey. The baby has known the dragon intimately since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is St. George to kill the dragon. Interesting. My daughter was a bit upset with me last week because I had to babysit for the two of them. Now, you know, I mean, she asked me to babysit. She should have taken the risk that Granddaddy would do strange things. So, 4 and 2-year-olds, right near where they go to school, there's this woman who for years, I've been told, puts up this incredibly terrifying display for Halloween. It takes her a month to do this. It's still under construction. I mean, it was when my granddaughter, age 4, definitely wanted to visit this. My grandson at age 2 in a couple of months, well, he didn't have an opinion, but he just came along. So we stopped the car and we went in front of this display. And my grandson, first of all, would not walk off the sidewalk. There were alligators creeping up onto the sidewalk. There was a witch over here. There were these pirates up there, ghosts hanging from various places. Yeah, boogeymen, everything. The place is incredible. But eventually, we were there for more than a half an hour. My granddaughter starts weaving through all these displays, you know, touching them. Let me touch them. And he starts following her, the 2-year-old. He touches the alligator. He makes a face at the witch. Okay, so I told my daughter that we took them there, and she said, "Good grief, he'll have nightmares for weeks now. Why did you do that?" He might, but then nightmares are a way of overcoming one's fears also. So I don't apologize. I'm not big on age appropriateness, stage theory and all of that. If there's human freedom, then anything can come from a child's mouth. Anything can be drawn by a child. Anything can be imagined by a child. And sometimes they figure things out that I can't figure out. So he's 2.5, so what? You know, he made a face at the witch. So much for you, witch. Chesterton had a test of fairyland. And in so doing, he commended it to all persons, young and old. I could go on and on. This is not good. The test of fairyland is the test of imagination, he said. And this test of imagination, he said, concerns moral truth. But moral truth is different from mathematical logic, he said. I'm quoting him. You cannot imagine 2 and 2 not making 3, but you can imagine trees not growing fruit and rock candy instead. The lesson of fairyland, however, is not that tomorrow morning I should expect to find growing in my backyard a tree whose limbs are weighted down with rock candy. The magic of fairyland is not physical or biological science. A fairy tale may tell of an evil witch who possesses the mysterious power to turn a good prince into a stone, and a fairy godmother with the equally mysterious power to turn that stone prince back into his rightful self. But the veracity of the moral truths illuminated by these two inhabitants of fairy tales does not depend upon an explanation of their powers. I repeat, fairy tales are not science, though they are a way of knowing every bit as important to human well-being as scientific knowledge. If we look in the fairy tale, for example, for an explanation of the transformative power of the fairy godmother, as we look for an explanation in science of how liquids turn to solids, we're bound to come empty-handed and disappointed. Rather, the magic of the fairy tale lies in its capacity, its compelling ability to make us see that we, each and every one of us, are capable of committing both the evil of the wicked witch and the good of the fairy godmother. Their great fairy tales enable us to see what is the difference between good and evil, and to judge whether we ourselves are like the wicked witch or like the fairy godmother. Their great fairy tales challenge us to test our imagination, in our imaginations, how we would respond to circumstances in which good and evil lie in the balance. And they invite us to make correlations between the imaginary characters and worlds they depict and the world in which we live. In this way, fairy tales exercise and build up the moral imagination, and they engender virtue. I'm going to have to cut back some of this and say a few things more. Here, let me start here. I've tried not to leave you with the impression that fairy tales are only for the young. For more than 20 years, as I've said, I've taught a college course in religion and children's literature. And here's the great joy of it. Each year, the young men and women speak up in the seminar to say that they were deprived in their childhood of the resources of the moral imagination. Not only were they not introduced to most of the stories and books on the syllabus, if they know them, they're probably from Disney, which is not exactly the stories in their original form. But they also recognized that their natural sense of wonder was starved. Now, I don't have to persuade them that the tasty food of fairy tales and the classic children's stories that we read in class is good also for the soul. They know it. Books like Bambi, The Secret Garden, The Wind in the Willows, or the tales of the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and George MacDonald. These are stories that possess a richness and a texture and an elevating quality accessible to anyone who reads them, whatever his or her age. So my students take advantage of these stories to revisit childhood one last time before they enter the adult world. That's the conversations that's most enjoyable. I just want to listen in. I don't even say anything, because they are working through these stories with a knowledge that they're going to, in some way or another, be leaving all of this behind. But isn't there a way to take at least a piece of it with you? To make certain that we don't leave it all behind. So they find them not only looking back, but also looking forward to their futures. They especially enjoy Peter Pan and the Mowgli stories in Kipling's Jungle Books, since they are about two children who don't want to grow up or join the real human world. But the stories end differently, and that's what's so exciting about their juxtaposition. Peter refuses to join the Lost Boys in the Darling household. He returns to Neverland instead, and he remains a child and a prisoner of his own passions, though he continues to think that this is freedom. Not exactly Disney. Don't think Disney. By contrast, the love and the wisdom of his animal mentors helps Mowgli to mature as a moral being. He struggles with choices and takes responsible action to protect beasts and human beings whom he loves. His character is refined, and in the end, as he enters puberty, he re-enters human society, a mature young man. Now, I also recognize that the views I've expressed do not belong to the common stock of contemporary educational orthodoxy. I've had some interesting conversations about that today. I realize that the appeals I make to a common human nature and a perennial literature defy postmodernist premises that even affect our views on ordinary pedagogy, though many receive these views unaware of just what the underlying anthropology is that gives rise to them. The underlying anthropology is anti-Christian, believe me. But the stories say it all. They speak of things that are perennial, such things as the joy of the birth of the first child, the crippling sorrow of illness and deformity, childhood fears of getting lost, matched by childhood desires to escape parental authority, the love that binds siblings, and the rivalry that tears them apart, the naming we do that gives identity, and the naming we also do that confuses identity, the curses of dread malefactors and the blessings of welcome benefactors, the agony of unrequited love, and the joy of love that is reciprocated. So I believe in moral truths, as I believe in human nature, that enable us to live in what else did Christ assume if not human nature? I mean, if there isn't a human nature, then there wasn't an incarnation. Now, I just won't buy that. I don't care what you have to say. I believe in moral truths that enable us to live and prosper, in which are no less important to living than the nutrition we receive from food and drink. Especially when young, we need to be fed on these truths as they come to us through the great stories of our race. Now, wherever I've gone, people have asked me, what is my favorite children's story? And that's a pretty hard choice, but I have to say it's Pinocchio. And in my book, the first chapter is on Pinocchio, on becoming a real human child. But I also warn my students when they read Pinocchio that they're not going to react to it the way a child will. A child will react to Pinocchio, boy, I mean, they just love it because of the repetition, in point of fact. Because this little fellow just keeps making the same mistakes over and over again the way I make mistakes. Now, it's a rogue's tale, and it's filled with repetition. And an adult, you see, has grown out of that, supposedly. We don't like repetition. It's poorly written, isn't it? No, it isn't. It's brilliant. It's brilliant in its repetition. But it's more than that. When I wrote the chapter, I muted, to a certain extent, my allegorical reading of it. And I think I was right in doing so. But I'm going to quickly give you the allegorical reading in 2 pages, or about 3.5 minutes, okay? In his own education, Collodi imbibed and took to heart Homer's Odyssey. He had to read it. I mean, it was required reading as children in Italy at the time. He had to read Virgil's Aeneid. He had to read Augustine's Confessions. He had to definitely read Dante's Divine Comedy. And I suspect he read Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress, though I don't have proof of it. And he borrowed elements of all these great works for his Tale of a Puppet. But Collodi was theologically educated also. In his youth, he attended an Augustinian seminary. And into Pinocchio, he wove motifs and themes from the Bible, especially Genesis and the book of Jonah, as well as Jesus' parables, such as the story of the prodigal son, the Gospel's account of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances on the road to Emmaus and in Galilee, and the crucifixion itself. Because in Collodi's Pinocchio, the puppet gets hung on a tree and pleads for his father to be there. Now, that's pretty obvious, okay? But more than this, Pinocchio recapitulates the story of the Passion and the hope of salvation in the sacraments, particularly of baptism and the Eucharist. So, we all begin as puppets, marionettes, do we not? Isn't being a child something like being a puppet on a string? What is more, Collodi's puppet is made from a troublesome and trouble-bound piece of wood, an allegory of our fallen human nature. And this stubborn, wooden-headed puppet does not listen to his father and otherwise counselors. Instead, he is struck with wanderlust and wanders from home, Like Odysseus, he wants to return home, yet is hindered by all sorts of external powers and confused and confounded by inner conflicts. Pinocchio yearns for his father, but must learn how to love unselfishly in order to rescue his father from the belly of a great Leviathan. He suffers for his innocence and his misbehavior, a paradoxical mix of childhood, and is hung on a tree to die. But for the intervention of a mysterious blue-haired fairy. The color blue is associated with whom? There aren't many Roman Catholics in this room, I assume. The Virgin Mary, that's right. That is his sister and his mother. She assumes both roles for him. And this would have been his end. And without her guidance and discipline, he surely would remain a vagabond. He calls himself such, and never become a true pilgrim or find his father. But he must become a pilgrim. That's the whole point. In the end, Pinocchio risks his own life to save his father's life, sacrifices his own needs to care for the aging Geppetto. None of this is in Disney, so don't even think. Okay? And to assist the blue-haired fairy when she falls ill. He has learned filial love, how to be a good son. And for these deeds and his good heart, his virtuous heart, and what he has become inside, Pinocchio is made a real boy with real flesh and blood, though surely, even before this physical transformation, he had gained his humanity. Or is that all really an allegory of immortality? Aren't we all puppets made of wood and wanting, struggling to become real in the kingdom that now knows no end? And what does it mean to become real? Why, to be formed in the very likeness of God, the same who we saw in the divine word and only begotten Son of God, who showed us what we might become by coming to us in the form of a man. That's the real story of Pinocchio. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
When I was younger, I read a lot of Andrew Lang's fairy books. Would you say those are close to the
Yeah.
original story?
You read the green book and the red book and the.
I read 10 of them.
Yeah, exactly. My mother did the same. My mother did the same. Yeah. No, that's true to form. So you were formed by those, whether you know it or not. Yes.
How do you think a kid sees Pinocchio?
Oh, I don't think that the child immediately goes to the allegorical interpretation I gave. Although I wouldn't put it past them, especially if they've learned Bible stories early on, because they make the correlations. The images are there in the imagination. They can make the correlations. When Pinocchio is hanging from a tree and begging for the presence of his father, if they've heard the story of Jesus' passion, I would say even a 5-year-old could put that together. Absolutely. But that's not the reason for, that's not where they start. Not at all. I think they start with a wooden puppet. That's what they feel like. A marionette. People are controlling them. They want freedom, but they know what trouble it gets them into. And they want to find out how many times he gets into this trouble and can he get out of it, etc. That's the immediate draw of Pinocchio. And what is repetitious to us is simply more and more opportunities to what shall I say, run the experiment over and over again. That's what a child loves about Pinocchio, and I think it is brilliant. It was serialized, so in some sense he had to be repetitive too. Well, serialization required that of authors, to a certain extent. They had to recapitulate. But he recapitulated more than a Dickens would or a Dostoevsky would, which are also serialized. And he did it on purpose. Somehow or other, a man who never had a child figured it out. But then there are others like that too, who never had a child who figured it out. Yes?
Do you think that,
No, you first.
and do you think that images, because we live in an era full of images, is that more helpful to kids, you know, having stock for their moral imagination, or is it worse?
Oh, well, I think we're all on overload. I'm trying to make sense of it because I wrote an article once about entering the age of sensibility, which is somewhere between the age of reason and mere instinct. Sensibility is. And image is right there with sensibility. Images are dangerous and also redemptive. It just depends. Oh, I'm not sure where we're headed. But just in terms of the prevalence of pornography on the internet, for example, it's not just the internet. I mean, all the media are filled with a kind of imagery that, in my view, denigrates the human body, even as it exposes it, and has very little to say about the human soul in the way that images are projected. So I'm not happy about much of it. But on the other hand, if you look around, you can find good stuff. But how many of us know how to do that? You know, I mean, it's not an easy task. It's much harder than going even to the library and picking out the right books, you know? Yes?
What would you say to the claim that a lot of people say, like, oh, kids have this, like, imagination, and then, like, you lose it when you grow up kind of thing? Like, I've heard that over and over again. Is that, like, do you think that's true? And if so, like, how do we stop that from happening?
Yeah. Read Peter Pan. Barry was basically overtaken by that problem because I think he really wanted to stay a child. And remarkably, he didn't gray, and he never grayed. His hair never grayed. So maybe, you know, maybe he solved the problem. I don't know. But no, that great fairy tale deals with that whole issue. Well, Never Neverland. What is Never Neverland as he describes it? It's an island, a distant shore that we remember from our childhood, but it's so distant now. And after a certain age, you can't go there anymore. C.S. Lewis even picks up on that because the Pevensie children at a certain age are no longer able to go to that Neverland, which is Narnia. So there's a truth there, and it is a truth. I can't live inside of make-believe the way my 4-year-old granddaughter lives inside of make-believe. I can't do it. I remember when I did it. You know, when she gets on the floor and starts lining up things and all of this, and all of a sudden it comes to life. And it's as real can be. You try that at the age of 67 and see what happens. First of all, my knees give out, but that's, yeah, I wanted to get you, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm interested in what makes a fairy tale Christian in its moral formation. And part of why I'm asking that is I think about Christian ethics. It's not just, love God, love neighbor, do not murder, these kinds of ethical principles, but it's in this larger theological context of, Romans 12:1. Therefore, in light of the mercies of God, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. And there's this undergirding of what God has done for us in Christ, and that is what issues forth into Christian ethic. It's this undergirding of Christ's work. And so, can you have, I guess my question is, can you have a story that lacks that proclamation of what Christ has done, and yet is still distinctively a Christian
It's not distinctively Christian, but it has a universal quality that is embodied in the gospel somehow, is taken up into the gospel. Look, John Chrysostom, the 4th century, he probably wrote the first Sunday school guidebook, actually. And he says to the parents, he says, there's nothing wrong with giving Roman and Greek myths to your children, for there are heroes there. And when they're introduced to the real hero, they will recognize him. Now, there was a great debate within early Christianity as to whether the classics were something that should be consumed, read, or expurged. He was one of those who believed that Christianity simply took in all of that and brought it to its final expression of truth in the Incarnation. Now, not all. When I wrote the book, Tending the Heart of Virtue, I was conscious to a certain extent of those writers who one could argue whose imaginations were formed by Christianity. Most of them were in one way or another, but I wouldn't want to overdo it. For example, I wrote a chapter on friends and mentors, and I juxtaposed 3 stories. The first being Wind in the Willows, the second being Charlotte's Web, and the third being Bambi. To one degree or another, all of those authors were affected by Christianity, to one degree or another. But White in Charlotte's Web, to a certain extent, mocks Christianity, even though he came out of a Protestant background and his grandfather was a Protestant minister, if not his father. On the other hand, Graham was a kind of Edwardian Christian, kind of loose, real broad, and brought Pan back into the picture. He was struggling with it. He was very attracted to Roman Catholicism. In point of fact, he spent time in Italy. And if he was going to be anything in his later life, devoutly, it would have been a Roman Catholic. He didn't join the Roman Catholic Church. Bambi is in some ways quite naturalistic in its depiction of a creation of a story. So I wasn't going after these stories to pick out Christian elements. I was going after them because they had certain universal themes. In this case, you start with a story about pure friendship, which children are immensely interested in starting at a certain age. And that's pure friendship. They're all on an equal plane, those animals. And they play. They never work. Charlotte's Web is somewhere in between. Wilbur and Charlotte are on some level friends, but on another level, Charlotte is his superior. She simply knows more. She is, in some sense, a mentor to him. And so there's a transition there. That was how I was interested in it. Mentors are very important, it should be in our lives, and can be very important in our lives, and I've been blessed with them. But mentoring is not the same thing as friendship. Friends choose each other. The mentor chooses the mentee. That's the real meaning of mentor. So that in the last story, Bambi is chosen by the great stag to replace him after the great stag leaves this world. And that's a story of pure mentorship. There's no equality between the two of them. All right? And that's what I was getting at. A child absorbs this in various ways. So, the stag may be in some way a father figure, a parental figure, etc. On another level, Charlotte's Web is attractive because it's an animal story with talking animals, but it's also because there's a friendship and bond there that children yearn for, and they yearn for even friends who are a little ahead of them that they can learn from, And then on the other hand, there's Wind in the Willows, where it's all play, it's just give and take. So there's value in that, apart from arguing Christian roots or images or themes within these stories. So don't get me wrong when I say that, when I gave you this talk, that the only stories I value are the stories that I know have a content which are formed by a Christian vision. Because not all the fairy tales are not. The Grimms took traditional fairy tales and Christianized them. There's no, the stories they tell are not the stories they heard. They created new stories. Cinderella may exist in various forms, but they created their own Cinderella. And it had a Christian vision behind it. There's no question. Hans Christian Andersen was an idiosyncratic Christian, but I would argue the Christian vision played a very strong role in all of his stories. But there are other stories that belong to the canon, which don't have much to say in terms of instructing us or guiding us to the Gospels directly or some such thing. And that's okay. That's okay. I think that, you know, some Christians would regard this as dangerous, but I think that the juxtaposition of fairy tales and stories out of the Bible can be very useful. There needn't be confusion. They can be very useful toward the maturation of a child and the development of a child's imagination, a good imagination. Yes?
Many of us who are students at Wheaton have come from Christian homes and have had the privilege of growing up kind of steeped in these stories, as you referred to earlier. And I'm sure that there are benefits of that, but I found that, at least for myself, that there's a tendency toward overfamiliarity and sort of missing the point through overfamiliarity. Do you think that the benefits of having a moral imagination furnished with those images outweigh the dangers of becoming so familiar with the stories that you just unfolded?
Well, I'm trying to understand what it is that your upbringing was exactly. So when you say that you were that stories were brought to you as a child, and there was a familiarity to them, and a kind of what was the word you used to describe this syndrome?
I don't know if I gave it a name, but overfamiliar.
Overfamiliarity. What do you mean by that?
In my experience, I mean, like, knowing the Bible stories and having read the Bible from a young age several times, and just knowing them, knowing what happens next.
Yeah. Okay, John Chrysostom again, in that little religious curriculum that he developed in the 4th century, says, okay, well, have them read the story of Cain and Abel. Have them read the story of Jacob and of Joseph and his brothers. Have them read the story of Esau and Jacob, and then ask them to repeat the stories. And if they confuse them, point out the confusion. I think what Chrysostom was getting at was that it's not merely memorization. It's the bringing together of these themes and images that is the creative process, and that we shouldn't just be asking children to memorize the stories. I think that's what he was getting at. He didn't develop it very far, because that's not what he was paying attention to as a bishop of Alexandria and then Constantinople. But it wasn't his responsibility, but he was getting at that. So maybe the overfamiliarity you're talking about is just that is just piled one thing upon the other without developing a sense of the relationships of these, the common themes in these stories, the commonalities and differences. The very exercise of engaging in those comparisons to go beyond the stories themselves. Maybe that's it. I don't know. But I'll tell you one thing: you're an exception to the rule. I mean, seriously, most of the students that come into my class, religion and children's lit classroom, do not complain of that. Okay? And they themselves are self-selected. So they have a reason to be there. More often than not, it's because they read some of these stories and want to go back to them and want to be introduced to more. What about the others who don't even register for the course? Well, in many cases, probably they've not been, not had any of these stories read to them. It's not at all surprising. I've watched in the culture. The Narnia Chronicles may have been put into the movies. But the familiarity with the Narnia Chronicles, the amount they're being read by American children today, is far diminished from when they were being read 30 years ago. They're not so secure. Yes?
So I hear you trying to defend the integrity of these earlier editions of fairy tales, because modern retellings often kind of soften them or erase what you see as key
Yes,
moral
that's right.
components that may be a little bit more unsavory, but that are important.
Yeah.
Developing the tools with which the children become adults, make moral decisions. But I'm wondering if you think that there's no room for improvement on them, because many of them are sexist or racist, and have those components in them. And I think perhaps there's a difference between, making them like more palatable and fun by like taking out the morality of them.
Give me an example of one that's sexist or racist. Begin with.
I mean,
like what?
I feel like there are lots, but I don't, and I'm not familiar necessarily with the original, but like Sleeping Beauty, for example. Like I find the idea extremely offensive. She is, first of all, taking care of a bunch of men, but also the prince sees her apparently dead, maybe sleeping, and thinks that it's okay to, to be attracted to her and to kiss her, which in these days.
Well, it's
like,
also Snow White's the same thing.
Well,
The prince,
that's what I mean, Snow White.
Snow White, the prince shows up.
I meant Snow White.
Yeah.
But that's, to me, reading that, I'm like, that's unacceptable. Like, I wouldn't want to teach that to my children, right? And so.
How many days did the seven dwarfs wait before they decided they would not bury Snow White, but put her in a glass casket?
I'm guessing 3
Resurrection. Who do you think the prince is?
Right, but.
You were with me before. I'm going to come at you. See, so that it seems to me that it's overwhelmingly evident that the religious Christian imagination of the Grimms was this: that at some point, their reader, who was far more literate than us in the Gospels and in the Bible, would grasp the allegorical meaning, the depths of the spiritual meaning. This is a story of the resurrection. The prince has come. The bride of Christ is she. Now, we can read, if you want to read it in sexist terms, you may. I don't know how else they would have, the kiss of peace. I mean, you can read it as sexist, but I can't take it there. I don't see it as that. All right? And I don't see that they were that they were sexists. Or do you mean misogynist? I'm not sure which. Many of the church fathers were, in some sense, sexist. I don't think they were misogynist. That is to say, they had a view of women which was not up to our standards of equality. There's no question about it. Though there are others that clearly defended that men and women were of the same nature and bore the image of God. So it's complicated. But so you find that offensive that he came in and kissed her. He didn't really kiss her as I recall see, I get confused too. I don't think in the Grimm story he does kiss her. They move her. No, not Sleeping Beauty. All right, Sleeping Beauty I haven't. I thought she was talking about Snow White. I don't know about Sleeping. I haven't studied Sleeping Beauty. I'll tell you, I haven't studied Sleeping Beauty. I may agree with you there, But Snow White, I can't imagine, is about that. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure it's as simple as what you just described, but, I'll go and read it tonight for you. I will. I just haven't gotten to Sleeping Beauty. Honestly, I haven't gotten to it. I haven't read all of them carefully. Yes?
Well, I think the questions here are twofold. One is it's the aggregate. It's women after woman after woman who is in a kind of put together, put in a sleeping state and needs to be rescued. So I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is we have accepted a materialist reading of those things, that we're looking at them. We're not looking at them from the perspective of the allegory or the symbol. We're looking at them and mapping them onto contemporary female bodies. And I think that in and of itself is something we need to be confronting and redeeming in multiple ways. We need to redeem the way the church handles sexual difference and gender difference after Pentecost, but we also need to redeem our imaginations in terms of accepting materialist limitations on who we are. Because that inscribes, my daughter has Down syndrome, that inscribes her as less valuable in the eyes of God if I accept a materialist determination that says she's less valuable in the eyes of human beings. And I can't do that. So I can't say that gender matters in a storytelling setting. So I think that there are two things going on there, and we need to think about both of them really critically.
Yeah.
This is something related to that. Oftentimes fairy tales are associated with female domesticity.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in your experience of teaching fairy tales and thinking about them, what your own experience is with this idea that these are for women or for girls who will become mothers to teach them to children, but that boys grow out of them and do other tasks that are more logical or rigorous or rational or something like that. And so it's related to that conversation in a lot of ways. What's your thoughts about fairy tales today?
I think that as adults, we need to read these stories critically and put them in the context of their time. And unquestionably, not so much for the Grimms, but more so for Perrault, that's exactly what they're up to. The domesticity issue is real. The woman has to mature into a wife or a housewife or whatever. That's the role that women play in the society in which these stories emerge.
Do you find that your students today are predominantly female?
Yes.
Or what's the challenge for getting male students to take these stories as meaningful?
Well, my experience has been that over the years at UVA, when I was 8 years or 7 years at UVA, the first time I offered the Religion and Children's Lit course, and this goes back to my teaching at Loyola as well, but let's just talk about UVA. The first year, say there were 30 in the class, there might be 7 men. The next time I offered it, there might have been 12. The next time I offered it, it was almost evenly divided. That had to do with that popularity of the course and the men actually coming around. But are you asking for an explanation as to why women come to these courses?
Well, I'm wondering if you have any theories as to why men today are uncomfortable with fairy tales in light of that law.
Oh, they're not. It's not uncomfortable. They're not interested in them.
So why do you think?
Oh, I think that the most of the women, but not all of them, mind you, they have differences of opinion, who come into the religion and fairy tales book course are more traditionally minded. So they have motherhood in mind. Absolutely. Should I refuse to teach them because they have motherhood in mind? That is to say, they want to take these stories with them into their later lives where they can bring them into their own homes. Yes, they're interested in domesticity, and the men are far less interested in domesticity. But I would not stop teaching the course because that's what motivates them. I know that In many cases, that's what motivates them, even when they bring literary critical skills into the classroom and they apply them to these stories. Yeah, that's the explanation. The men in our culture have been persuaded that they need not be domestic at all, not even providers, for God's sakes. And stall. They never grow up. Yes.
There are women at UVA who are planning to be mothers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's amazing, isn't it? Not only that, there's a trend toward earlier marriages among a certain group, mind you. Evangelicals, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, self-identifying. They are marrying early, many of them right out of college now, which I think is even a bit early, mind you. But it is a kind of a revolution. It's not a big one. It's not most of the students, but I can identify them. I know them. I follow them through their lives. I mean, I was in touch with one that graduated 4 years ago just yesterday. Yeah. And that's why they do come. I think that's a real motivation for the women. That explains why the women are there. It may also be other things. Women come to the course because they're more interested in literature, perhaps. The English department has far more women in the department than men. I don't know, but I know from their lives, which they bring to me into the classroom, that yes, they're here with a purpose in the classroom. And they want me to show them how to read a story, ultimately to children. The men, most of them could care less. I used to kid them. The first time I taught the course, there were like 6 guys in the class. I said, okay, what are you here for? You look around you. I said, is it because there are a lot of women in the classroom? Is it, I kid them. Well, as it turned out, one of them was a father. 2 of them were fathers, okay? They were older students. There were explanations, okay? But, yeah, I think it's quite clear. They're self-selected in my course.
But you're not necessarily saying that that's a sort of okay thing, that the men in our culture don't seem to care about these stories, right?
Oh, it's not okay at all. If we're worried about women being too domestic, we ought to be worrying about men not being domestic enough. And let me tell you, they're not interested in romance. I teach a course on sex and creation in the Christian faith. Boy, when we get into subject, the last third of the class is all about all about courtship. Then it really starts to come out. Let me tell you. Okay, so I've explored this a bit. I have. And there's a correlation between the fact that the men don't show up in the course on children's literature and the fact that they're hesitant to show up in the course on sex and creation because they won't talk about it. The women will. They're not happy, the ones that come in my class anyway. They're not happy with the men. Bunch of dodos. So the last time I taught the religion and children's lit class, I put on Frank Sinatra's fairy tales will come true, it can happen to you when you're young at heart, right? Young at heart. And I let it play for a few minutes, and then I say, all right, the floor is open for dancing. They did not expect this in the course on, okay? I can see the girls, they want to dance. If I thought I wouldn't be prosecuted for dancing with them, I'd dance with them. But I would be prosecuted, so I don't. But the guys are just sitting there. It's so sad. It's so sad. Yes?
I had a question. You were talking about looking for the original fairy tales, and how you have trouble with there being so many versions of them that are retellings. And
Yeah.
I think there's room to retell the stories. Like, not just for political reasons, as she was mentioning, although a lot of them are sexist and racist and anti-Semitic, but also like we retell them because they belong to us and they're our cultural heritage and we're free to shape and change that. Don't you think there's room for that?
It's my choice. I want the originals because, frankly, the genius of the creators of those fairy tales generally outdoes any of the retellers' genius. Now, there are retellings of fairy tales that can be good, but at this point in my life, I'd rather find the real tale well illustrated if I can find it. Now,
Bible story. Similar in the Bible stories are so short. So some people will retell or discuss the Bible story and elaborate and elaborate. Obviously is apocryphal, but it could be more interesting.
It could be. It might be written so that a younger child can apprehend it, attention span and all the rest.
So what are you saying? For Bible stories for children, go ahead and elaborate?
I'm hesitant to see. Yeah, I'm hesitant in retellings. But I you know, that's a little bit different because I view the Bible as not just books taped together, but as a story told in a way. They're all related to. So you have to be very careful.
But I was wondering what this, the one question about the Bible story, I just got over and over the same Bible story, and that's partly because you may have only heard one version. So now we've got other versions, so that you say, oh, maybe Cain meant this, or maybe Abel meant that, and it's just so short. But if we really think, like it says, meditate Psalm 1, we meditated the night watches, what? On the lost. We're meditating on these stories and thinking about what did Cain mean by this, what did Abel mean by that. Aren't we going
I'm getting the impression as the young lady who spoke. Would you like to speak again?
Oh, I didn't ask that original question, but I had an idea as we were talking about this. Would you say that then there's a difference between retelling or having a story that has like the spirit of the story retold versus the basic plot of the story retold? And as I was thinking about the difference between, you have these fairy tales that are mostly operating on more an allegorical, spiritual level, versus you have things that, television shows that are mostly...
They have an allegorical and spiritual level. They can be read on a literal level or a moral level, but they have an allegorical and spiritual level, which much of contemporary criticism ignores. It doesn't even exist.
So would you say that a retelling that is focused, that is trying
I'll tell you what bothers me about most retellings. The carefully laid elements of a story by an accomplished writer get swept away, and they're incredibly important for the depth of the story, for the richness of the story, for what it has to say to us about our humanity. And most of these retellings, frankly, are inferior. They unravel the stories and then put them back together in a rather clumsy fashion, most of them. Or they're insipid, frankly. I really believe that. I've read through them over, and I mean, you know, I study this. It's an avocation. It's not I'm not a literary person. I'm a theologian.
But you and I both know that Grimm's is not the original, so it's a retelling too.
Yeah, but but these were oral tales. They were not written by and large. They were oral. You know, they created these stories. There's no question about it. But how many Grimms do we have in Western culture? Not many. Would you want somebody to rewrite Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov?
No, I just want my students to understand that these are not the originals. Grimm did not come up with this. What you know, you said today, 7th century Egyptian.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There are any number of Cinderella stories. They created a whole corpus of fairy tales out of the oral history that they collected. There's no question about that. Yeah. Now, what you're saying is that we could possibly have authors in our present day who collect all these stories and create their own stories.
Yes.
Yes. While not pretending that they are the same story, which they more often than not do. They do pretend they're the same. They're marketed as the same story. There's a deception there, and that's what I'm objecting to. If you want to create something new, then say it's new. Don't market it as something that it's not. That's what I'm getting at. There are great children's stories writers in the 20th century and 21st century. They are creating great literature. I mean, there's no question about that. But they're not in the deception market. Yeah. But they're marketed that way. Just get on Amazon and look at
You
it.
and I both know Grimm changed the stories to fit, the Grimm brothers changed them to fit what they wanted them to say, so that's the same thing.
No, it's not the same thing. No, it's not.
It is the
That was
Grimm
it.
stories that hold for us the magic that is embedded in our culture, not the stories that came before. So I think what he's trying to say is that,
I hear it.
correct me if I'm wrong, but those are the ones that are familiar to us and those are the ones that have informed us.
It's
That's
not one
right.
that we're familiar with, though. We're more familiar with the Perrault version, which came before Grimm.
You're talking about Cinderella now.
Yes, in this specific.
I don't think that would hold true in Europe. It holds true in America because Disney went to Perrault. There's, that's the simple fact of the matter. And if you want to take something like The Little Mermaid, forget it. It's not even the same story. I mean, there's a certain slipperiness in all of this. All I'm saying is they're marketed as the same. Tell me it's a new story. Tell me it's a really, truly new version. And I'll be interested in looking at it. But not a reduction of the original, where all the elements that were carefully put together in order to give that story such richness and depth are taken out for one reason or another, to accommodate the publisher's demands on how many pages it's supposed to be and so forth and so on. And we know that's happening. Or some preconception about what a child can or cannot absorb. That's what I object to. Yes?
This will be the last question.
I'm just gonna one of the things that we do is we do think and meditate on these stories and we embellish them. Ballads, Terry Windley said that ballads, for instance, are stories without motivations. They're plots without motivations. And a lot of the stories, the Grimm brothers stories, are plots without motivations. And so a lot of what the new retellings are to imagine those motivations. Again, it's something you have to engage critically. You can't just say it because the motivations aren't there in the originals, and so you're teasing them out. And that seems to be what's upsetting you in some ways.
Well,
And
yeah,
because it does
that's
change the
interesting the
frame.
way you put
It
it.
changed the frame.
Because when I look at them, I become very suspicious of what the motives are behind what I would call Bawdlerization of these stories. There are motives behind them. They're not a creative act that presents itself as a creative act. They present the story as retold, as somehow faithful to the story. And I'm not sure they are. Because you're right, there is a motivation behind it. Yeah, it's interesting.